Last year, during a road trip, I found myself in a rather unusual situation. I was searching for a place to spend the night when I stumbled upon a small motel along the way. The structure was located in an isolated area and didn't look appealing from the outside at all. Given the late hour and the area I was in, I didn't have any alternatives, so I decided to stop anyway. As I pulled into the motel parking lot, I noticed there were no cars parked except for a pickup truck, presumably belonging to the motel manager. It seemed strange that all the rooms were vacant, considering it was an isolated area but still a thoroughfare. I decided not to dwell on it and headed towards the entrance. As soon as I entered the reception area, I was greeted by a man with a strange appearance. He had an unkempt beard and a disturbing look in his eyes. He didn't give me a good impression, but as I mentioned earlier, I didn't have much choice. After a brief and uncomfortable interaction with the man, he handed me the room keys. I was assigned room number 12. It was the most isolated and furthest from the reception, located at the far end on the left. Given the unsettling atmosphere of the place, I asked if it was possible to have a room closer to the reception, saying it would be more convenient for me. Obviously, I didn't tell the real reason to avoid revealing my fear and discomfort. My request was denied as I was told that the rooms closer to the reception hadn't been cleaned yet, which seemed strange and clearly an excuse, given that there was no one around, and they would have had plenty of time to tidy up any occupied rooms from the previous night. I was told that the only alternative available to room number 12 would be room number 19, located on the other side of the motel, also very far from the reception. At that point, not knowing what else to say, I accepted room number 12. As soon as I stepped into the room, I was engulfed in a heavy atmosphere. The floor was covered in dust, the bed was crumpled, and the sheets were not exactly clean. It almost seemed like it hadn't been remade. The furniture, on the other hand, looked very dated. There was an old television set on one of them. I decided to turn it on to distract myself a bit, but soon noticed that not all channels were working. I tried to tune them in to keep me company, but to no avail. I lay down on the bed, and despite being dead tired, I couldn't completely relax. That place was giving me incredible anxiety. I had a constant feeling of being watched for some reason. Every now and then I looked around, but there was never anyone there. Around midnight, as I tried to fall asleep, I heard a strange noise coming from outside the room. I thought it was just my imagination overwhelmed by tiredness, but a moment later, I distinctly heard the handle of my door slowly turning. With my heart pounding wildly, I immediately got up from the bed and approached the door. I flung it open, and in the darkness, I caught a glimpse of a shadow swiftly moving away. My first instinct was to scream, but something held me back. I immediately grabbed the phone and dialed the reception number, telling the man there that there was someone lurking outside the motel. The man on the other end of the line didn't seem surprised, but said he would take a look around. I always doubted that he did what he said. I decided to get back into bed, but shortly after I was woken up by some noises, this time seeming to come from the window. It was clear by now that someone was trying to break into the room. I approached the window and again noticed that shadow peering into my room, then quickly retreating as soon as it noticed my presence. I quickly closed the curtains with a rough gesture, trying to fend off the growing sense of dread inside me, and returned to bed. Sleep was now just a dream. I was too agitated. I fervently hoped that whoever was out there wouldn't show up again. But unfortunately, after about half an hour, I heard noises again from outside the room. At that point, I grabbed my suitcase and decided it was time to leave. That night had become a nightmare. It was around 4 a.m. when I stepped out of the room and closed the door behind me. With swift steps and trying to make as little noise as possible, I headed towards my car. In the parking lot in the distance, I saw a figure staring at me. I presumed it was the same person who had been watching me for several hours. Without wasting any more time, I got into the car, started the engine, and drove away from that cursed place, hoping to never encounter that dark individual again. After driving several miles and making sure I had distanced myself enough from that place, I began to reflect on the fact that I couldn't just forget what had happened. So, as soon as I found an area with signal, I decided to call the police to report the incident. An officer on the phone listened to everything I had to say and told me they would go to the scene immediately to conduct investigations, but as I feared, they found nothing. Despite this, I decided to do everything I could to inform other travelers of the potential danger of that motel. I wrote a long, detailed review on the website where the motel was listed, recounting my experience and warning anyone interested in staying there, hoping that my words could save someone else from experiencing what I went through. After about a month, I read the news that the motel had closed down. I don't know if my review contributed to this, but I felt a sense of relief knowing that no one else would have to experience the same situation as me. It was an experience I would hardly forget, but at the same time, I am glad to be able to tell it. I had always considered air travel as a sort of personal challenge, an experience to be faced only on special occasions. My life was marked by only 5 flights, all 5 for vacations between South America and Africa. I've always been an anxious type, so the only way to deal with them was with a good dose of tranquilizers in my bloodstream, indispensable allies to overcome the anxiety that pervaded me at the mere thought of boarding a plane. Air travel wasn't the only stressful time in my life. During my college years, I studied at a college about 1,500 miles away from home. Trips back home involved long car journeys to reach family, with nights spent in various motels scattered along the interstate. I still remember those long stretches of road, the monotonous noise of the tires on the asphalt, and the loneliness of the night, broken only by the reflection of passing truck lights. Once, during one of these trips, I witnessed a scene that made me shudder. I'd been driving for several hours and fatigue was starting to set in. So, I decided to stop at a motel along the way. I had never been there before, but it was the only one for the next 200 miles. As soon as I arrived at that motel, there was a man behind the reception desk. Without wasting time, I paid for the night and retrieved the key to my room. I was heading towards my room when I noticed a car parked. An elderly man, about 70 years old, was searching for something in his car. An instant later, a car pulled into the motel parking lot, from which 3 men emerged and immediately approached the man who was still intent on his search. The scene seemed harmless, but something told me that something was about to happen. In the meantime, I entered my room and watched them from the window as the situation unfolded before my eyes. What happened left me speechless. The 3 men, for some reason, had a key to that man's room and forcibly coerced him to enter his room. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to intervene. I wanted to do something, but I was afraid of making the situation worse. I felt a tangle of emotions tormenting my mind. I wanted to call the police, but the fear of misunderstanding the situation paralyzed me. The idea of meddling in other people's affairs, of looking foolish, or of putting myself in danger, paralyzed me. After anxiously waiting for about 15 long minutes, during which the men remained inside the room with the man, I decided to act. I felt I had to do something to help that elderly man, even though I wasn't sure what the best course of action was. With my heart in my throat, I headed towards the motel reception. My mind was a storm of thoughts and worries. How could I explain the situation to the receptionist? What if he didn't believe me? What if my interference only made things worse, but the urgency of doing something outweighed any doubt and fear? I had to at least try to ask for help, to let someone know that something was happening at that motel. When I reached the reception, the man running the motel had fallen asleep behind the counter. With a mixture of impatience and anxiety, I gently woke him up and explained the situation in a breathless voice. I told him that there were men who had forcibly coerced another guest into his room and that I was afraid he might be in danger. The receptionist seemed skeptical, almost indifferent to my words. Despite my efforts to be clear and convincing, he looked at me with a bored air and barely shook his head. "Don't bother," he said with an annoyed tone. "Let them sort it out among themselves," he said with a smirk. At that point, given the receptionist's indifference, as I walked away from the motel reception, I began to think that he might be involved with the 3 men who had forcibly coerced the man into his room. At that moment, it was the only explanation I could give myself. As I returned to my room, I noticed that the men were still inside the man's room. Suddenly, as I watched what was happening, I saw the 3 men forcibly take the man again, drag him out of the motel, and then force him into their car. An instant later, the car drove away from the motel. The temptation to enter the men's room to search for evidence that could help me understand the situation overwhelmed me, but at the same time, the idea of meddling further and putting myself in danger held me back. At that point, driven by a sense of responsibility and the desire to do the right thing, I decided to immediately call the police. I told them all the details, explaining that there had been a kidnapping. The officers promptly arrived at the motel and conducted a search of the elderly man's room. They found nothing strange except for a note on one of the nightstands with an address written on it. This address led to an old warehouse. The investigations, as I suspected, later revealed that the receptionist was involved in the matter, as he turned out to be the owner of the warehouse where they held the old man captive. In the end, fortunately, the receptionist and the 3 men were arrested. It was discovered that the reason behind the kidnapping was a matter of personal revenge against the elderly man for issues related to the past. Even today, 7 years later, I have not forgotten this incident. This experience taught me that it is essential to act when we see someone in distress, because only by joining forces and collaborating can we build a safer and fairer world for everyone. Of course, I hope I never experience anything like this again. I am a 37-year-old woman, and what I'm about to tell you happened about 3 years ago during a stay at an old motel. I was on a business trip, and the next day I was supposed to meet some people for business discussions. It was around 8 p.m., and there were still about 150 miles to go to reach the place where I was supposed to be the next day, so I decided to stop at a motel for the night. The structure was a bit dated, but since I was in a remote area, I couldn't expect anything different. As soon as I arrived at the motel, I went straight to the reception. As I entered, I noticed a man sitting in a chair who stared at me the whole time while I was talking to the receptionist. After a while, the receptionist asked the man if he was waiting for someone since he didn't seem to be a motel guest. The man replied yes. Immediately after, the receptionist asked him if the person he was waiting for was a motel guest. Suddenly, visibly annoyed and without saying a word, the man got up from the chair and left. The receptionist and I looked at each other for a few seconds, incredulous at the strange behavior of that man. Once I was given the room key, I headed towards it. My heart skipped a beat when I saw that man sitting in the chair outside the motel. It seemed like he was waiting for me. So, I hurriedly walked to my room. Suddenly, I started hearing footsteps behind me. I didn't turn to look, but I was almost certain he was following me. I quickly opened the door and entered the room. Shortly after, someone knocked on the door. I looked through the peephole, and when I saw it was that man, my blood froze. I began to wonder what he wanted from me. One thing was certain, he didn't seem to have good intentions. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. In the end, I decided not to open the door and immediately called the reception to report his presence. The receptionist reassured me to stay calm and that he would take care of it. After hanging up, I approached the peephole again to check, but that man was gone. Maybe he had heard my phone call and decided to leave to avoid trouble. Even though that man was no longer outside my door, I couldn't calm down. That situation had shaken me. After a few minutes, someone knocked on my door again. I felt relieved when I saw it was the receptionist, so I opened the door and he told me he had checked around, but there seemed to be no trace of that man. He had disappeared into thin air. Before leaving, he told me that I could call the reception for anything, and he would come immediately to resolve the situation. To release the built-up tension, I decided to take a hot bath. I stayed in my room for about an hour before going out to grab something to eat at a small restaurant I had noticed a couple of miles away. When I left the motel, I looked around to see if that man was somewhere nearby, but fortunately he wasn't there. I headed to the restaurant, had dinner, and then returned to the motel. As soon as I entered, I noticed that the light in my room was on. I thought maybe I had forgotten to turn it off in a hurry before leaving, but it made me somewhat worried. I entered the room, but I felt uneasy. I decided to go out again to go to the reception, where there were some vending machines for drinks. I needed a chamomile tea. After about 20 minutes, I headed back to my room, and as I walked, I heard footsteps behind me again. just like when I had just arrived at the motel. Again, I didn't turn around and briskly walked to my room. Once inside the room, after about 30 seconds, someone started banging loudly on the door. I looked through the peephole, and it was him. I didn't know what to do, whether to call the reception or 911. I was in total panic. I decided to call the reception first, thinking that the receptionist might arrive before the officers since he was closer and could handle the situation more quickly. As soon as the receptionist arrived, that man started running away. I was shocked by what was happening. I couldn't believe it. Fortunately, the receptionist immediately called the police, who arrived on the scene within minutes. After a brief search around the motel, law enforcement managed to locate the man who had hidden on the roof of the building. Shortly after, that man was arrested by the authorities and taken to the police station for questioning. Fortunately, thanks to the prompt action of the receptionist and the timely response of the police, the situation was effectively handled. Although the experience was terrifying, I am grateful for the help I received. Even today, I wonder what would have happened if that man had managed to enter my room. Every time I think back on it, I shudder. It was a night some years ago. The sky was covered with clouds and distant thunder could be heard, a sign that a strong storm would soon reach us. My mother, my father, and I were on a journey to visit some relatives we hadn't seen in a while. Given the weather conditions, we decided to stop at a motel along the road to spend the night. We were exhausted after hours of traveling and were looking forward to getting some rest. After checking in, we entered the room, and honestly, the first impression wasn't the best. The walls of the room were completely faded, the lights flickering. It wasn't a nice place at all. Personally, I didn't like sleeping away from home. It always made me anxious, and I must say that place didn't help at all. After about 15-20 minutes, we got into bed, exhausted. However, in the middle of the night, I was awakened by a dull noise coming from inside the room. From the dim light, I saw a shadow moving in the darkness, but I couldn't make out any details. Strangely, shortly after, without realizing it, I fell asleep again. About an hour later, I woke up again, disturbed by the same noises. I looked at the clock on the nightstand. It read 4:15 in the morning. I got up from bed cautiously, trying not to make too much noise to wake my parents. I walked slowly towards the source of the noise, which seemed to be coming from the bathroom. When I reached the door, I flung it open, but there was no one inside. Perhaps it was just the sound of the wind, I thought. Or maybe my imagination was playing tricks on me. I decided to wake up my father, seeking comfort in his presence. "Dad, there's something strange in the bathroom," I said anxiously. He woke up suddenly, his eyes still blurry with sleep. He followed me into the bathroom to take a look around, but we found nothing suspicious. "You must have been dreaming, son," my father said reassuringly. But I wasn't convinced. That sense of unease persisted. Then, as I scanned the room carefully, I noticed that the shower faucet was dripping incessantly. "Look, Dad," I said, pointing to the faucet. "Maybe it was just this that I heard." My father approached and examined the faucet. "It could be," he said, giving a twist to the valve to stop the water leak. "Maybe this is what woke you up." I decided to go back to bed, hoping to finally find some peace, but as soon as I closed my eyes, a sound broke the silence of the room. It was a strange sound, like a muffled whistle. I had to find out. With some fear, I hurried out of bed and ran to the bathroom. When I reached the door, a faint voice echoed in the air. "Help, please. Help." I realized that the whistle was not coming from inside the room, but from outside the bathroom window. Looking out, I noticed a man crouched on the ground. His presence was unsettling and sent shivers down my spine. Without hesitation, I called my father and told him about the man outside the window. My father, becoming irritated, got up from bed. After checking the man from the bathroom window, he headed towards the door and went outside the motel towards him. I ran after him, trying to hold him back and shouting, "Dad, stop! It's dangerous!" But it seemed like he couldn't hear me. With determined steps, he approached the man with a stern look and clenched fists and yelled angrily, What are you doing here on the ground? What do you want? You're scaring my son." The man slowly got up, looked my father in the eyes, and said that the room was his and that we had to leave. After a brief discussion that was about to turn into a fight, we decided to go back into the motel and went back to bed. After a while, someone knocked on the window. We went outside the motel again, but there was no one. My father, visibly annoyed, decided to call the motel reception to report what had happened. After a brief conversation, they assured us that they would send someone to check the situation. After about 10 minutes, there was a knock on our room door. It was the motel manager, accompanied by a security guard. They informed us that they had checked the surroundings and had not found anyone matching the description of the man we had seen. We didn't know what to say or think, so we thanked them and returned to our room. Given the accumulated tension, we stayed awake for the rest of the night. A few hours later, the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains. At that point, we packed our bags, handed the keys to the motel staff, and left the place in a hurry. As we drove away, we watched the motel getting farther and farther in the rearview mirror. With a sigh of relief, we realized that we had left behind that stormy night. As the hours passed, the tension gradually faded, replaced by a feeling of relief and gratitude for having come out unscathed from that absurd situation. About 7 years ago, my girlfriend and I decided to take a road trip. The driving hours were many, and dead tired, we decided to look for a place to spend the night. After wandering a bit in search of accommodation, we found a small motel that had only 4 or 5 rooms available. We were so exhausted that we would have accepted anything. Entering the lobby, we were faced with a huge man behind an old counter. After asking him for a room for the night, the man nodded and smiled eerily, revealing a smile with teeth yellowed by cigarette smoke. Immediately after, he began to fill out some forms and took note of our information. That place conveyed a sense of obvious neglect. On the desk were old surveillance monitors and some documents all stained, probably from the drops of whiskey that man was drinking. Once we got the key, we hurried into our room, leaving behind us the unease that man had transmitted to us. The room was modest, with a double bed, an old television, a small table, and a tiny bathroom. It was evident that the place hadn't seen a renovation in years. After washing up, we got into bed trying to find some rest. Around 3 a.m, I woke up with an urgent need to go to the bathroom and noticed that the lights in the room weren't turning on. I decided to put on some clothes, and despite feeling sleepy, I headed to the reception to report the issue. The lobby was dark and deserted, with only the dim light of an incandescent lamp illuminating the counter. I approached cautiously, calling out softly, "Is anyone there? The lights in the room aren't working. We're in the dark." No one answered. The only thing that could be heard was the background sound of an old radio. I approached the counter more, trying to figure out if there was anyone. By chance, I glanced at the old surveillance monitors. I was petrified. One monitor showed the motel parking lot, another the back of the motel, and another showed our room with my girlfriend sleeping peacefully on the bed. My heart began to beat furiously in my chest as I watched the scene in disbelief. Who was watching those images? And how was it possible that there was a camera in our room without us noticing? I felt a chill at the mere thought that someone had been watching us all that time. I ran to the room, woke up my girlfriend who was still sleepy and didn't understand what was happening. I told her we had to leave quickly and that I would explain everything in the car. We grabbed our suitcases and left that place within minutes. Once we had distanced ourselves enough from the motel, I calmly explained everything I had seen to my girlfriend. My voice trembled slightly as I tried to find the right words to describe the situation. She looked at me with incredulous eyes, unable to believe what I was telling her. Then, suddenly, she burst into tears. I decided to go to the nearest police station and report what had happened. A police officer listened to me carefully and, after taking note of our testimony, informed me that we were not the first to have experienced that situation. The motel owner used to film rooms where there were couples, and if the night took an interesting turn, he would upload the recordings online. The officer explained that several reports had been filed in the past, but so far it had not been possible to incriminate the motel owner. Fortunately, we were okay, although we were still very shaken by the situation. We decided to leave that bad episode behind and continue our journey. Over time, the police finally managed to gather enough evidence to arrest that man and close the motel. After that trip, we learned the importance of being careful about where we stopped during our travels and never taking our safety for granted. It was 1997, and my family had decided to embark on a journey along the roads of Oregon. It was me, my father, my mother, and my two sisters. By evening, we were all quite tired and decided to stop for the night at a small motel along Route 101. It was an old building with a rusty tin roof and windows covered in dust. Despite its neglected appearance, we decided to give the place a chance, drawn to the allure of the mystery that seemed to surround it. My father approached the reception, where an elderly gentleman with a mysterious look assigned us a room. We paid the $19 required for one night and headed towards our accommodation. The room we found ourselves in was dark and gloomy, with old furniture and a disgusting smell of mold in the air. On a dresser sat an old 80s television. I tried to turn it on, hoping it would distract us from the discomfort, but the reception was poor and the sound didn't work. Around 11 p.m., while we were all trying to fall asleep, we suddenly heard the door handle move. A shiver ran down our spines as the faint sound of the lock being manipulated sent chills down our veins. My father got up from the bed, his eyes fixed on the door, ready to confront whoever might be about to enter at any moment. Whoever was on the other side seemed unable to get in. My father approached the door and began to pound on it with his fists, while with a firm and authoritative voice he shouted for them to leave. Suddenly, whoever was on the other side stopped trying to open the door. The tension hung thick in the air as we waited, holding our breath, to see if the intruder had gone away for good or would resume trying to open the door. We looked at each other, fear in our eyes. My mother gathered her courage and approached the window to take a look outside, but the darkness was so dense that she couldn't see anything. After about 10 minutes, we decided to go back to bed. My father made sure all the doors and windows were securely locked and turned on a small nightlight he had in his suitcase. The night passed quietly, although due to the agitation, we didn't sleep very well. The next morning, my father went to the reception to tell them what had happened and seek explanations for the strange episode of the previous night. He approached the counter, looking around to find the elderly gentleman who had assigned us the room, but the reception was empty. There was no one in sight, neither customers nor motel staff. With some perplexity, he called out several times, but no one answered. It almost seemed like the motel had been abandoned overnight. At that point, he decided to leave the keys on the counter and leave that place as soon as possible. To this day, we are unaware of who the person was who tried to enter our room that night and what their intentions were. Over time, this story has become an anecdote that we tell to friends and relatives. When I was 12 years old, my mother had to go to California for a work conference and decided to take me with her. It was the first time I went with her on one of her trips, and the excitement was palpable. After driving who knows how many miles, we decided to stop at a motel for the night. The place wasn't too bad. Sure, it wasn't a 5-star hotel, but what mattered to us was that there was a comfortable bed to rest for a few hours. Plus, the reviews were positive, and the price was reasonable. During the night, around 2 in the morning, while we were deep in our dreams, we were awakened by a loud knock on the door. My mother went to open it and found the motel owner standing there, telling her that we needed to vacate the room immediately because he had made a mistake with the bookings and had mistakenly assigned it to us when it had actually been booked by another customer who would arrive shortly. My mother, thinking I was asleep, went out of the room to discuss with him. Shortly after, their voices woke me up, and I stayed to listen to what they were saying. After a while, the argument was escalating, so I started to worry. I approached the door and told my mother to forget it and come back into the room. My mother listened to my words, turned, leaving the man at the door, and said, "Hurry, let's pack up and leave." As I was busy packing my things, I heard agitated voices coming from outside. I looked out the window and saw a group of guys starting to argue heatedly with the motel owner. In seconds, the situation became rather tense. My mother, sensing the risk, locked the door. We watched from the window as the guys kept pressuring the owner, saying things like, "Hey buddy, you gotta pay to stay here, you won't get away with it easily." The owner replied firmly, saying he didn't want trouble and would sort everything out. My mother, with a worried expression, turned to me and said, "Stay calm, everything's fine. Keep getting ready." Her voice was calm, but I could sense a slight tension. As I continued to pack my things, the voices from outside became less audible. I looked out the window and saw that the group of guys had left, leaving the motel owner alone at the door. He stood there for a few minutes, thoughtful. Shortly after, he headed towards the reception. At that point, since the situation seemed to be resolved for the moment, we could have stayed there, but we decided to leave anyway. As we exited the motel, I still remember my mother's face. She was frightened, in a panic, even though she tried to mask it. Once inside the car, we quickly drove away from the motel. At one point, I asked my mother, "Mom, what happened out there?" My mother smiled sweetly and said, "It was just some minor trouble between the motel owner and those guys. Nothing to worry about, sweetheart. The important thing is that we're safe." Reassured by her words, I relaxed in the seat and looked out of the window, watching the nighttime landscape slowly passing by. Only now, after many years with the mind of an adult, can I fully understand the seriousness of that night's situation and my mother's ability to handle it in the best possible way. Despite being a single woman with a child, she managed to face the situation calmly and determinedly, protecting me and maintaining my peace of mind. Only now can I fully appreciate the courage and strength she showed that night, and I am grateful to have had such a brave and protective mother. It was a 5-year night, and my girlfriend and I were traveling along a road that seemed to have no end. The car's engine seemed to have some trouble, panting like an exhausted sailor. Our only hope at that moment was to reach a motel to spend the night before the car decided to abandon us for good. Unfortunately, shortly after, the car stopped about a mile from the motel. Fortunately, it decided to leave us at a point where there was enough space to leave it there without obstructing the passage. At that point, we grabbed our suitcases and walked towards the motel. After about 15 minutes, it was there in front of us. The faded neon above the reception emitted a pale glow, creating a rather unsettling atmosphere. We entered the reception and were faced with a tall, slim, and scruffy-looking man with a wrinkled shirt and a bored expression. He looked at us with a kind of indifference before greeting us with an unconvincing tone. "Good evening. What can I do for you?" he asked in a monotone voice like a broken record. We explained our situation and asked for a room for the night. "You're lucky," he said. "It's the only room available. It's the best in the motel. I take special care of it." Great, we thought. A moment later, he handed us the keys and pointed us in the direction of the room. As soon as we entered, we noticed that the room was very dated, bare, and without any charm. The bed seemed to have seen better days and the bathroom emitted an unpleasant smell. Thank goodness it was the best in the motel, I thought. I dare not imagine the others. We decided not to dwell on it. What mattered to us was to spend the night, fix the car, and continue our journey. We lay down on the bed and started searching the internet for a mechanic in the area who could repair our car, but unfortunately we couldn't find anything suitable. The nearest workshop turned out to be about 50 miles away, which was a decidedly excessive distance for us. We decided that the next day we would ask the motel manager, who surely would know how to help us in some way. At that point, we turned off the lights and tried to sleep, unaware that the night would not be so forgiving. It was about 1 a.m. when I was awakened by a strange sound. I got out of bed trying to figure out what was happening. My girlfriend woke up too, looking at me wide-eyed. From the motel window, we saw a shadow. We couldn't quite make out if it was a man or a woman. With uncertain steps, we approached the window. As we got closer, the outlines became clearer, and we realized it was indeed a man. His figure was tall and slender, wrapped in a dark cloak that fluttered lightly in the wind. The dim light of the neon illuminated the area slightly, but not enough for us to see his face clearly. As we watched that man's appearance, unable to understand what he was doing out there, suddenly his figure approached the glass of our room. Our hearts started beating fast. Fortunately, it was dark in the room, so he couldn't see us, but we could see him, which terrified us. At that point, we didn't know what to do. We decided to call the reception for help. The reception was close to our room, so we could hear the phone ringing. As soon as the phone started ringing, the figure outside our window hurried away, running towards the reception. After a few seconds, someone answered the phone. The realization froze us. We immediately understood that the man outside our window was the hotel manager who had been watching us, and upon hearing the phone ring, he rushed to answer it. We were stuck there, trapped in our room while that man roamed outside the motel with who knows what intentions. We didn't close our eyes all night and waited anxiously for the first light of dawn, praying that moment would come soon and allow us to escape from that cursed place. When the sun finally began to rise, we didn't hesitate for a moment. We gathered our few things, leaving behind every trace of that terrible night, and rushed out of the motel, eager to put as much distance as possible between us and that place. Once at the car, we desperately tried to get it started, but to no avail. Meanwhile, a man with a van, seeing us in trouble, stopped and offered to help. He took us to an old mechanic friend of his, who, although he no longer had the workshop because he was retired, was the only one nearby who could help us. So that man came back with us to the car and fixed it on the spot in about half an hour, finally allowing us to continue our journey. We didn't know how to thank him for his generous gesture that had saved us from that bad situation. So, we finally resumed our journey, trying to forget that horrible night spent at the motel. I hope such a situation never happens again. Last year, a friend and I were on a trip to meet two girls we had met online who lived in a city about 200 miles away from us. We had planned this meeting for some time and were looking forward to getting to know them. Although the distance by car was relatively short, we decided to leave the night before and stop for the night at a motel. This choice allowed us to arrive fresh and rested the next day, after a refreshing shower, and to avoid arriving sweaty and smelly due to the intense heat. We stopped at a motel located near their city, a distance that would only require half an hour's drive to reach the girls the next day. Once we arrived, we entered the motel's reception. The facility wasn't bad for $40 a night. The walls were decorated with paintings depicting local landscapes, and there were some comfortable armchairs for waiting customers. The guy behind the counter welcomed us with a friendly smile and asked if we had a reservation. After confirming, he handed us the keys to our room and showed us the way to get there. Finally, he wished us a good night and said we could reach out to him for anything we needed. With the keys in hand, we headed to our room, ready to rest and prepare for the next day. Upon arriving in our room, we found ourselves in a cozy and clean environment. The room was simply but comfortably furnished, with a double bed covered with fresh, clean sheets. On the walls were paintings of relaxing landscapes that contributed to creating a tranquil and soothing atmosphere. Both my friend and I were quite excited for the next day, which didn't allow us to fall asleep peacefully, so we decided to turn on the TV to relax a bit. After about 5 or 10 minutes, we began to hear noises coming from one of the adjacent rooms. They didn't seem to come from the room next to ours, but rather from the next one. We started to wonder what could be causing those strange noises. We decided to step out of our room and take a look outside. When I opened the door, I noticed that the two doors of the rooms next to ours were wide open. In the first room there was no one, and neither was there in the second, but in the second room, we noticed that someone had left the water tap open. We didn't know what to think, so we decided to go back to our room. However, as soon as we returned, the noises resumed, as if someone were banging against the walls. The situation was taking an unsettling turn, and we began to worry about what might happen. At that point, we decided to go to the reception and tell them what was happening. As soon as we arrived, we explained to the receptionist what had happened. With a concerned expression, he told us that those two rooms were empty and that he would check immediately. However, when the receptionist reached the door of the rooms, the doors were closed. The receptionist took the keys and opened them, and as soon as we entered, we immediately noticed that the bathroom tap was now closed. It was as if nothing had ever happened. We were baffled and confused. We didn't know what to think, but one thing was certain. We wouldn't be able to sleep peacefully that night. We thanked the receptionist for his intervention and, despite the confusion, decided to return to our room. Shortly after, however, the mysterious noises resumed. Of course, we couldn't completely ignore them, but we decided not to pay them too much attention. As soon as it was morning, we grabbed our things and quickly left the motel. To this day, we haven't been able to give an explanation for those mysterious noises. But one thing is certain. We were happy to leave that unsettling place and never set foot there again. Six months ago, my best friend and I made a bold decision to embark on a round-the-world trip. Even today, we are still on the journey, and I'm writing these lines from our hotel room here in Paris. Finally, we managed to fulfill our dream of working online and exploring the world. What I'm about to tell you is an experience that happened to us 3 months ago, and I hope it never happens again in my entire life. We were in Texas, for privacy reasons. I won't disclose the exact location. After months of planning and saving, we had abandoned the restrictions of a traditional job to embrace the freedom of being masters of our own time and destinations. One evening, exhausted from the long journey, we decided to stop at a motel along the road. It was a building that seemed to have seen better days. The facade was peeling, and the windows were dirty, but we didn't care. We just needed to recharge our energies to continue the next day. The room, though humble, offered a cozy refuge from the fatigue of travel. After getting ready for bed, we lay down, and after planning the next day, fell asleep. About 2 hours after we had fallen asleep, around 3 a.m., our rest was interrupted by screams and sirens. We woke up abruptly, confused and disoriented, surrounded by smoke and flames. Panic gripped us. Without wasting time, we rushed towards the exit. Outside, all the motel guests had come out of their rooms, agitated as much as we were. After a few minutes, fortunately, the rescue teams arrived and managed to extinguish the flames. Shortly after, the police arrived, who, after conducting preliminary investigations, concluded that it was an arson attack. They asked the motel owner if he had recently had any disputes with anyone, and if he had enemies who could have caused all this. He replied that although he had had some problems in the past, it had happened several years ago. However, the possibility that someone wanted to settle scores, despite the time that had passed, was not ruled out. After the police finished their investigations, they asked us if we had noticed anything suspicious during our stay at the motel. We told them that we were only there for one night, and that we hadn't noticed anything strange until just before going to bed. After about 2 weeks, the truth about who caused the fire finally emerged. It was a group of former employees of the motel who had had problems with the owner in the past. It was discovered that the motel owner had refused to pay their salaries for several months. Enraged by the injustice they had suffered and eager for revenge, these former employees had planned and carried out the fire to settle the scores. The fact is, their action that night endangered the lives of many innocent people. In the end, the members of the group responsible for the fire were arrested and brought to trial. After the incident, we decided to leave Texas and continue our journey to new destinations. We were lucky to have woken up in time and managed to get out before the fire spread further. The mere thought of what could have happened still sends shivers down our spines today. For my 16th birthday, I decided to organize a trip with some friends. We were all passionate about movies and often enjoyed imagining ourselves as protagonists in film adventures. What particularly fascinated us were motels, often featured in iconic scenes in movies, so we decided to stay in one to feel like real movie actors. Before going to sleep, we decided to take a walk outside the motel to get some fresh air. Sometimes I suffered from anxiety and needed to take a breath of fresh air. We were on an isolated road with a car passing by occasionally, considering the late hour. Suddenly, a car entered the motel parking lot from which 5 guys got out. They had something in their hands and seemed violent, with no good intentions. Given the way they walked, they were definitely drunk or under the influence of some substance. Suddenly, the guys started attacking us for no reason, and one of my friends had his nasal septum broken. After the assault, the guys quickly left. We decided to call the police, who arrived at the scene after a few minutes. They told us that the place was dangerous and that we shouldn't have gone out alone at that time. We told them that we were unfamiliar with the area and therefore unaware of the danger. Shortly after, the officers accompanied my friend to the hospital for his broken nose. He was treated and returned to the motel after about 2 hours. At that point, we locked ourselves in the room and didn't go out anymore. The lesson was enough for us. The next day, my friend still had pain in his nose, so we preferred to go back home instead of continuing the trip. What was supposed to be an unforgettable experience turned into a real nightmare. Certainly, next time we will inform ourselves better about the areas and take greater precautions. It was an experience to forget. It was a cold winter evening when my faithful dog Max and I set off to visit some of my relatives who lived outside the city. I remember the snow falling lightly as we made our way along the roads to their house. It was my first time driving in that area, and despite having GPS, I felt a bit disoriented, perhaps due to the unfavorable weather conditions. After a while, I realized we were lost. The road was dark and deserted, and the snow made it difficult to distinguish road signs. Eventually, given the time, I called my relatives, telling them that the snow had made the roads impassable and that I would reach them the next day. At that point, we stopped at a modest motel along the road to spend the night. It was clear from the start that it was not a luxurious place, but we needed rest and warmth. The motel was a low, square building with a barely visible sign. We entered the lobby, and an elderly gentleman greeted us warmly but with a tired smile. The room we were assigned was very simple but had all the essentials. Moreover, the cleanliness was not bad either. During the night, while I was sleeping heavily, I was awakened by a strange noise. I jumped out of bed and realized with horror that Max was no longer beside me. My heart leaped into my throat and I rushed out of the room. At that moment, there was a snowstorm, and fortunately, in the distance, I could see a man dragging Max away. I started running towards the man, screaming. After a brief confrontation, I managed to free Max. I don't know who that man was and why he took my Max, and especially how he managed to enter my room without me noticing. At that point, we returned to the motel room. The cold was unbearable. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I reflected on the incident. I was grateful to have Max back by my side. The next day, we set off again, finally reaching my relatives' house. Their warm welcome put me in a good mood, and finally, I could relax after the nightmare I had experienced. We stayed there for almost a week and then returned home. I don't know what I would have done without my Max if I hadn't been able to save him. Even today, that experience comes back to me. It was terrible.